The night my father stood at the head of that banquet table and slid envelopes across to my brother and my sister, I watched the whole room hold its breath. Then he got to me. He smiled, the way you smile at someone you've already decided doesn't count, and said, "Nora, you've always been the independent one. No envelope, no check, just a toast, just applause from people who didn't know enough to be ashamed of themselves." But across the table, my Uncle Roy set down his sweet tea, real slow, looked me dead in the eye and said, "She already took care of you, baby girl." I had no idea what that meant. I would spend the next 72 hours finding out. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 31 years old and I grew up in a town called Cedar Line, Tennessee. Population maybe 4,000 if you count the folks out on the county roads. My dad, Dennis Callahan, spent 32 years managing the receiving floor at a paper mill in Hartsburg. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he wasn't poor either. He was careful. He was deliberate. And when it came to his 3 kids, he was painfully, unmistakably unfair. My brother Kyle is 35. He married a woman named Brittany, who coordinates everything my dad approves of, which is a lot, and he works a sales job that sounds more impressive than it is. My dad calls him the businessman. My sister Leanne is 28, and she is the kind of pretty and agreeable that my father has always mistaken for goodness. He calls her his little sunshine. They both live within 15 minutes of the house I grew up in. They both show up to Sunday dinner without being asked. They both know exactly how to laugh at my dad's jokes. And then there's me, the one who moved 2 hours away to Knoxville at 22 to take a job with a housing nonprofit, the one who doesn't call enough, doesn't come home enough, doesn't nod along enough. I'm not difficult, I'm just honest. And in my family, those 2 words mean the same thing. The person who never confused them was my Aunt Cecile. Cecile Hargrove wasn't my blood aunt. She was my mother's older sister, and my mother passed when I was 9. But Cecile stepped into that house like she owned the grief in it, took one look at me and decided I was her business. She drove from Asheville every other weekend for 3 years straight. She taught me to drive in the parking lot of a Piggly Wiggly. She sat with me through every hard thing I didn't know how to name. When I got into a scholarship program for urban planning, she was the only person in my family who framed the acceptance letter. My dad tolerated Cecile the way you tolerate weather. Inconvenient, but unavoidable. She saw through him, and he knew it. And they existed in the same rooms with a politeness that had teeth. Cecile passed 14 months ago, pancreatic cancer. Fast and brutal and completely unfair, the way all the worst things are. I drove to Asheville to help her sort through paperwork in her final weeks, and she kept telling me, "There's nothing to worry about, Nora. Everything's been handled." I thought she meant her estate. She had a small house, a garden, some savings. I assumed it all went to her own kids. I didn't ask questions because she looked tired, and I wanted her last weeks to feel peaceful, not like a transaction. I cried more at Cecile's funeral than I did at my own mother's. I think because I was old enough this time to understand exactly what I was losing. Now back to the party. My dad's retirement dinner was held at the Riverside Grill in Hartsburg, the nicest restaurant in a 40-mile radius. 60-some-odd people packed into the private banquet room. Mill co-workers, neighbors, church folks, my dad's poker buddies, Kyle and Leanne and their families, and me, sitting at the far end of the table nearest the emergency exit, which felt appropriate. My dad gave a speech. It was long and proud and full of things that were probably true, but felt rehearsed, the way things feel when someone has practiced being grateful without actually feeling it. Then he said he wanted to honor his children. He slid a cream-colored envelope to Kyle first. Kyle opened it and grinned the grin of a man who already knew what was inside. Later, I'd find out it was a check for $40,000. "For the house edition," my dad said, then an envelope to Leanne. She pressed her hand to her heart and teared up on cue. $30,000? "For the kids' college funds," my dad said. Then he looked at me, and he smiled that smile. Nora's always been the independent one. She doesn't need the same kind of help. She figures things out." He raised his glass. "To Nora." The room raised their glasses. A few people glanced at me with that particular look, somewhere between sympathy and relief that they weren't me. I raised my glass too. I smiled. I have had 31 years of practice at that smile. That's when Uncle Roy set down his sweet tea. Roy is Cecile's younger brother, one of my mother's people. He's 63, built like a man who's moved furniture his whole life, and he has never once in my memory said something he didn't mean. He looked at me and said it low enough that only I could hear. "She already took care of you, baby girl. You just don't know it yet." I drove home to Knoxville that night, replaying those words. At 2 a.m, I called Roy. He answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting. "Roy, what did Cecile do?" A long pause. Then, "You need to call a man named Patrick Gideon. He's a lawyer out of Asheville. Cecile made me promise not to say anything until after your daddy's party. Said she wanted you to see it for yourself first." "See what for myself?" "Who your father is, and who she was." He paused again. "She made me promise she went first, so you'd understand why what she built for you matters. Call Gideon Monday morning." I didn't sleep. I didn't try. Monday morning, I called Patrick Gideon at 8:01. He had a calm voice, careful and precise, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has delivered complicated news more than once. He asked me to come to his office the following Wednesday. I asked if he could just tell me over the phone. He said it would be better in person. I drove to Asheville on a gray November morning, with my heat broken and my nerves shot, running through every possible version of what this could be. A small savings account, a keepsake, some piece of jewelry Cecile wanted me to have. Patrick Gideon was in his early 50s, corner office, framed degrees, and a rubber tree plant that had clearly been there for 20 years. He shook my hand and set a file folder on the desk between us. "Your Aunt Cecile began working with me in 2016, he said. "She came to me initially with a concern about a property matter involving your father." I went still. He continued. He was precise and unhurried and gave me everything in order. In 2016, my father had persuaded Cecile to co-sign on a refinanced mortgage for the family home, the house I grew up in, claiming he needed the credit support for a lower rate. Cecile signed because she trusted him. What my father didn't tell her was that he'd listed her on the new deed as a joint tenant, not a co-signer. If Cecile had passed without addressing it, my father would have had a legal claim to her own property in return. Something about how the attorney who drafted it had blurred the reciprocal terms. When Cecile discovered what had been done, she didn't confront my father. She came to Patrick Gideon instead. Over the next 7 years, quietly, methodically, Cecile built a legal wall. She removed her name from anything my father had access to. She documented everything. And then she built something else, a trust. Not a large one by some standards, but real. Funded through her savings, the sale of a rental property she'd bought in the 90s, and a life insurance policy she'd been quietly paying on since I was 12 years old, since the year my mother died, and Cecile apparently decided right then that she wasn't going to let me be left with nothing. The trust had one beneficiary. Me. $214,000, liquid, already transferred, in my name, managed and legally protected from any family contests because Cecile had given Gideon 9 years to make it bulletproof. There was also a letter. 1 page, handwritten, in Cecile's small, precise handwriting. I won't share all of it because some things belong only to the person they were written for. But I'll tell you the last 2 lines. Your mother would have done this herself if she'd had more time. I had enough time for both of us. I sat in that office and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was 9 years old, and someone told me my mother wasn't coming home. Not the quiet, polite kind. The kind that comes from somewhere below the rib cage, from the place where you store the years of being told you're too much or not enough or simply invisible. Patrick Gideon slid a box of tissues across the desk and waited. He'd clearly done this before. When I drove home, I stopped at a Cracker Barrel outside of Gatlinburg and ate breakfast food for dinner and sat in the parking lot until the sky went from orange to purple to black. I thought about every Sunday dinner I'd sat through, every family gathering where I'd been the afterthought, every time my dad had called me independent, like it was a compliment when we both knew it was a verdict. I thought about Cecile sitting across from a lawyer in 2016, 9 years ago while I was still in college, already deciding that I was worth protecting before I even knew I needed it. I called Roy from that parking lot. He picked up and just said, "You okay?" "No," I said, "but I will be." He laughed, soft. "That's exactly what she said you'd say." I haven't confronted my father. That conversation may come or it may not. What I know is that it won't change anything that matters. The money is mine. The documentation is solid. And whatever story he's been telling about me, the independent one, the difficult one, the one who doesn't need anything, that story ended in a lawyer's office in Asheville 7 years before I even knew it had been challenged. I'm using part of the trust to put a down payment on a house in Knoxville. A real one. Not an apartment with drafty windows and a radiator that sounds like it's arguing with itself. I'm using another part to finish a certification program I'd been putting off because I told myself I couldn't afford the timing, and I'm putting a portion aside in a separate account I've named, privately, just for myself, the Cecile Fund. Someday, if I'm lucky enough to be the person someone else needs, I want to be ready. The letter is in my desk drawer. I read it when I need to remember what it feels like to be seen clearly by someone who has no obligation to see you at all. That's the rarest thing I know of. Rarer than money, rarer than property, rarer than any check slid across a banquet table to the children who stayed close and laughed at the right moments. My dad handed out envelopes the night of his retirement party. Mine had a word inside. Independent. But 7 years before that night, a woman who loved me because she chose to, not because she had to, had already handed me something else entirely. Not in an envelope. In a legal trust. In a letter. In 9 years of quiet, deliberate work. She handed me the thing my family always made me feel I hadn't earned. Ground to stand on. And every morning when I wake up in this life I'm finally building, I feel it under my feet.